The annual Galactic Botanical Research Conference was, by all accounts, the most boring event in the known universe, which made it the perfect place for something spectacularly stupid to happen. Dr. Maya Rodriguez stood in the main conference hall of Verdant Prime Station, watching a parade of the galaxy's most brilliant botanical minds shuffle around with their potted death traps and poisonous pretties. The Zentorians had brought something that looked like a disco ball crossed with a cactus. The Regelians were fussing over what appeared to be sentient moss that kept trying to escape its container, and somewhere in the crowd she could hear Captain Blebus, the station's perpetually nervous Glorpian commander, making his third announcement about proper specimen containment protocols. Maya sipped her coffee and wondered, not for the first time, how she'd ended up as the only human at an event where everyone else seemed determined to prove that intelligence and common sense were mutually exclusive. "Attention, esteemed colleagues," came a pompous voice over the station's speakers. "Professor Quilbert Thornwick of the Zentorian Academy of Botanical Excellence will now present his groundbreaking research on the domestication of aggressive flora." Maya nearly choked on her coffee. Domestication. Right, because that had worked out so well for literally everyone who'd ever tried it. The crowd parted with the kind of reverent whispers usually reserved for religious ceremonies or pending disasters. Professor Thornwick emerged, all four of his spindly Zentorian arms carefully maneuvering a hovercart that carried what could only be described as nature's attempt at creating a nightmare. The creature in the reinforced transparent container was about the size of a small dog, if small dogs had razor-sharp teeth lining a mouth that took up half their body, and if they occasionally snapped at their own reflection with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Black Friday sales. "Behold," Thornwick announced, his chest puffing out with the kind of pride that preceded most galactic incidents, "the Venusian snapjaw, successfully domesticated through advanced Zentorian behavioral modification techniques." Maya watched the plant slam itself against the container walls with what looked like pure, unadulterated rage, and couldn't help but notice that Thornwick's definition of domesticated seemed to differ significantly from, well, reality. "Beautiful specimen, Professor," gushed Dr. Kelvin Sproutsworth, a Rigelian whose own research involved plants that screamed when touched. "How did you manage to suppress its natural hunting instincts?" Thornwick's forearms gestured dramatically, through careful application of sonic frequencies, controlled environmental stressors, and a precise feeding schedule that maintains docility while preserving the specimen's essential characteristics. The plant chose that moment to emit a sound that was part growl, part shriek, and entirely terrifying. Several nearby researchers took a step back. Maya took a step forward. There was something about the way the creature was moving, something that reminded her of her old dog Rex when he'd been left alone too long. "Magnificent," Thornwick continued, apparently deaf to his plant's obvious distress. "Observe how it maintains its alert posture while remaining completely non-aggressive." The snapjaw hurled itself against the container with enough force to make the hovercart wobble. Maya raised an eyebrow. If this was non-aggressive, she'd hate to see what Thornwick considered hostile. Captain Blebus appeared at her elbow, all six of his eyes focused on the plant with the kind of expression usually reserved for incoming meteor strikes. "Dr. Rodriguez," he whispered, his translator making his voice sound like a rusty door hinge, "please tell me you see what I see." Maya nodded slowly. "A very large, very angry plant that's about 30 seconds away from turning this conference into a botanical horror movie? That's exactly what I was afraid you'd say." Maya's prediction proved optimistic by about 29 seconds. The moment Thornwick began his controlled feeding demonstration, things went sideways faster than a Rigelian diplomat at an honesty convention. He opened a small feeding port in the container and dangled what looked like a chunk of synthetic protein on a 4-foot telescoping probe. The snapjaw regarded this offering with the kind of disdain usually reserved for cafeteria food. Then it lunged. The plant didn't just grab the food. It grabbed the probe, the professor's hand, and about half of his dignity in one lightning-fast motion. Thornwick shrieked in what Maya assumed was academic outrage as the snapjaw used the probe like a crowbar, prying open the container's feeding port until it was large enough for a very determined plant to squeeze through. "Security to Botanical Hall 7, Captain Blebus shouted into his communicator, his voice climbing several octaves. "We have a code chlorophyll situation." The snapjaw burst from its container like a green torpedo with anger management issues. It hit the floor running, well, scuttling really, on dozens of tiny root feet, and immediately made a beeline for the nearest food source, which happened to be Dr. Sproutsworth's lunch. The Rigelian screamed as his carefully prepared meal of fermented algae paste disappeared into the plant's maw in one gulp. The Snapjaw paused, considered the taste, and then looked around the room like a customer who'd just discovered the buffet. Fascinating, Thornwick said, apparently unable to read the room. Note how it immediately begins foraging behavior when removed from artificial constraints. Foraging, Maya muttered, watching the plant chase a vegan research assistant around a table. Is that what we're calling it? The conference hall erupted into the kind of chaos that made Maya grateful she'd skipped breakfast. Scientists scattered like startled birds, clutching their precious research samples and making the sort of undignified noises that never appeared in peer-reviewed journals. The Snapjaw, meanwhile, seemed to be having the time of its life, sampling everything from Dr. Fernsworth's rare Andromedan spore collection to someone's abandoned sandwich. "Why isn't anyone doing anything?" Bleebus wailed, watching his insurance premiums skyrocket in real time. Maya looked around at the assembled experts, all of whom were either running in circles or standing paralyzed with academic horror. The plant had discovered the refreshment table, and was methodically working its way through what appeared to be every item containing sugar. For a supposedly vicious predator, it seemed remarkably focused on snack foods. "They're all waiting for someone else to handle it," Maya said, setting down her coffee cup. "You know, like responsible adults." The Snapjaw had found the dessert section and was making happy little chomping sounds as it devoured a tray of what the Andromedans called comfort crystals, but which tasted suspiciously like cotton candy. Its aggressive posturing had shifted into something that looked almost playful. Maya tilted her head, watching the creature's behavior. Something wasn't adding up here. Predators didn't usually stop to savor their food, and they certainly didn't make contented little humming sounds while eating conference pastries. "Professor Thornwick," she called out, "exactly how long has your specimen been in that container?" Thornwick, who was currently hiding behind a display of non-toxic ferns, adjusted his academic robes. "Approximately 72 standard hours. Why do you ask? And when did it last eat?" "I maintain a strict feeding schedule. Every 48 hours, precisely measured portions of appropriate nutrients." Maya did some quick math and felt her eyebrows climb toward her hairline. The plant hadn't eaten in 3 days, had been trapped in a box barely large enough to turn around in, and was now surrounded by the alien equivalent of strangers pointing and taking notes. No wonder it was acting out. "Captain," she said, "I don't think we have a rampaging monster problem." "What do you mean?" Bleebus asked, watching the Snapjaw discover a bowl of what looked like alien trail mix. "It's terrorizing my station." Maya watched the plant carefully sort through the mix, eating some pieces and discarding others. "I think we have a stressed-out pet problem." While the galaxy's finest botanical minds continued their impressive display of running around like headless chickens, Maya did what humans did best. She ignored the experts and trusted her gut. "Okay, buddy," she said, walking slowly toward the Snapjaw, which had finished demolishing the refreshment table and was now eyeing a decorative fern with what looked like mild interest. "Let's see what's really going on here." "Dr. Rodriguez!" Thornwick shrieked from behind his fern fortress. "That creature is extremely dangerous. My research clearly indicates aggressive tendencies toward unfamiliar organisms." "Your research," Maya said, without taking her eyes off the plant, "also indicated it was domesticated. So maybe we should take your scientific conclusions with a grain of salt, the size of a small moon." The Snapjaw had noticed her approach and turned to face her, its massive jaws slightly open. But instead of the aggressive posturing she'd expect from a predator, Maya saw something else entirely. The plant's movements were jerky and erratic, its coloring was off, and there was a slight tremor in its leaves that reminded her of every stressed animal she'd ever encountered. "You're not a monster, are you?" she said softly, crouching down to the plant's level. "You're just scared and hungry, and stuck in a room full of idiots taking pictures." Behind her, she could hear Captain Bleebus frantically coordinating security responses. "Team Alpha, approach from the ventilation sector. Team Beta, establish a perimeter around the specimen storage area. Team Gamma, start calculating our insurance deductible." The Snapjaw tilted what Maya assumed was its head, studying her with what looked like curiosity rather than malice. Its aggressive stance relaxed slightly, though it kept one suspicious eye on the crowd of scientists who were still treating it like a ticking bomb. "Dr. Rodriguez," Dr. Sproutsworth called out, his voice pitched somewhere between academic concern and outright panic. "You're exhibiting extremely risky behavior. That specimen has shown no positive response to sentient interaction protocols." "Maybe," Maya said, slowly reaching into her jacket pocket, "that's because your interaction protocols are garbage." She pulled out a small protein bar. Emergency rations that every human carried because you never knew when you'd be stuck somewhere with nothing but alien food that tasted like disappointment. The Snapjaw's entire demeanor changed the moment it caught the scent. Its aggressive posturing melted away, replaced by what Maya could only describe as hopeful attention. "When's the last time you had real food?" she asked, breaking off a small piece of the bar. "Not that processed nutrition paste these academics think passes for a meal." The plant's response was immediate and heartbreaking. It approached her with the kind of desperate caution of an animal that had learned not to trust but was too hungry to care. Maya held out the piece of protein bar, and the Snapjaw took it with surprising gentleness, its razor teeth carefully avoiding her fingers. "Impossible," Thornwick breathed. "The specimen shows no capacity for discriminatory feeding behavior." "The specimen," Maya said, offering another piece, "shows plenty of capacity. You just never bothered to figure out what it actually wanted." The Snapjaw made a soft, rumbling sound as it ate, its aggressive posture continuing to relax. Maya noticed that its coloring was already improving, the sickly yellow undertones fading as its natural green returned. "This is highly irregular," announced Dr. Farnsworth, an Andromedan whose research focused on plants that could survive in pure vacuum. "Uncontrolled interaction with aggressive flora violates 17 different safety protocols." "You know what else violates safety protocols?" Maya asked, watching the plant settle into a more comfortable position. "Keeping a clearly social creature in solitary confinement for 3 days, without proper food." The room fell silent except for the Snapjaw's continued contented munching. Maya could practically hear the wheels turning in a dozen highly educated alien brains, most of which seemed to be stuck in some kind of academic feedback loop. It's making a sound," Sproutsworth whispered. Maya listened. The plant was indeed making a sound, a low, rhythmic rumbling that she recognized immediately. "Yeah," she said, unable to keep the amusement out of her voice. "It's purring." "Plants don't purr," Thornwick stated with the kind of academic certainty that had probably gotten him tenure. "This one does," Maya replied, offering the Snapjaw another piece of protein bar. "Turns out when you feed them properly and treat them like living beings instead of science projects, they tend to be a lot more cooperative." The plant had positioned itself next to Maya's leg, still making its soft rumbling sound. Occasionally it would look up at her with what she was becoming increasingly convinced was genuine affection. The transformation was remarkable, from raging beast to contented companion in the span of 10 minutes and half a protein bar. "This is impossible," Thornwick repeated, his forearms gesticulating wildly. "Venusian Snapjaws are solitary predators. They don't form social bonds. They don't exhibit comfort behaviors. They certainly don't purr." "Maybe," Maya suggested, scratching the plant behind what looked like an ear. "They do all of those things when they're not being tortured, in the name of science." The Snapjaw leaned into her touch, its purring intensifying. Around the room, the galaxy's most brilliant minds stood frozen in what Maya could only assume was a combination of scientific crisis and wounded academic pride. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet usually reserved for moments when entire scientific paradigms crumbled into dust. Maya continued scratching the Snapjaw behind its ear equivalent, enjoying the way its purring seemed to vibrate through the floor plating. "Professor Thornwick," she said conversationally, "when you say this plant is a solitary predator, you're basing that on field observations, right?" Thornwick's academic composure was beginning to crack around the edges. "Well, naturally, the research is based on established xenobiological literature and controlled laboratory studies." "So no," Maya interrupted. "You've never actually observed one in its natural habitat." "The dangers of field research on Venus are well documented," Sproutsworth chimed in, apparently eager to defend academic theory over messy reality. "Direct observation would be extremely hazardous." Maya looked down at the Snapjaw, which had rolled over to expose its belly in what was unmistakably a request for tummy rubs. She obliged, and the plant's purring reached levels that were causing sympathetic vibrations in the nearby water glasses. "So let me get this straight," she said, addressing the room while the supposedly vicious predator made happy little chirping sounds. "You've spent decades studying these creatures, without ever actually meeting one, declared them irredeemably savage based on laboratory behavior, and then acted surprised when years of imprisonment and malnutrition made them cranky." The assembled scientists exchanged glances that suggested Maya had just committed some form of academic heresy. Dr. Farnsworth cleared his throat with the kind of official disapproval that came with advanced degrees. "Dr. Rodriguez, you're anthropomorphizing a non-sentient organism. The creature's current behavior is likely a stress response, not genuine emotional bonding." Maya looked at the Snapjaw, which was now completely relaxed, Its teeth retracted, making sounds that would have been adorable coming from a kitten. "Buddy," she said to the plant, "what do you think about being called a stress response?" The snapjaw made a sound that was remarkably similar to indignant huffing, then deliberately turned its back on Farnsworth and snuggled closer to Maya. The message was clear even to the most academically obtuse observer. "Remarkable," whispered Dr. Petunia Flowerbottom, a botanist from the Outer Rim whose research focused on plant-animal hybrid ecosystems. "It's demonstrating selective social bonding and emotional intelligence." "No," Thornwick said firmly, his voice taking on the desperate edge of a man watching his life's work evaporate. "This is impossible. Snapjaws are Class 5 aggressive specimens. They don't bond, they don't purr, they certainly don't enjoy belly rubs." Maya stood up, the snapjaw immediately moving to stay close to her legs like a devoted dog. "Maybe they don't do any of those things when they're treated like lab rats instead of living creatures." She reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small emergency ration pack. Dehydrated fruit that was supposedly edible by most carbon-based life forms. The snapjaw's eyes lit up with what could only be described as delight. "The thing is," Maya continued, feeding the plant small pieces of fruit while it made happy chomping sounds, "you've all been approaching this from the wrong direction. You're trying to control behavior instead of understanding it." "Understanding," Blebus said weakly, "is considerably less important than containment when dealing with dangerous specimens." The snapjaw, apparently sensing the captain's nervousness, wandered over and gently nudged his leg with its head. Blebus froze like he'd been touched by death itself, but the plant just looked up at him with what Maya was beginning to recognize as its equivalent of puppy dog eyes. "Dangerous," Maya said dryly, watching the captain's panic slowly transform into confused wonder as the plant began purring again. "Absolutely terrifying." "This changes everything," Flowerbottom breathed, pulling out a recording device. "If snapjaws are actually social creatures, then our entire understanding of Venusian ecology is fundamentally flawed." "Not just Venusian ecology," Maya said, scratching the plant under what might have been its chin. "How many other, aggressive species have you classified without ever bothering to ask what they actually need?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya could see the implications dawning on the assembled researchers. Decades of research, countless papers, entire academic careers built on the assumption that if something had teeth, it must be violent. Thornwick made a strangled noise that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid and uncomfortable reconstruction. "But the literature clearly states—" "The literature," Maya interrupted, "is written by people who've never met the creatures they're studying. You want to understand a living being? Try talking to it instead of talking about it." She knelt down next to the snapjaw, which immediately rolled over for another belly rub. "What do you say, buddy? Want to show these nice scientists what you're really like when someone actually pays attention to your needs?" The plant responded by doing something that made every academic jaw in the room drop simultaneously. It began to glow. Not with bioluminescent threat displays or warning coloration, but with a soft, warm light that pulsed in rhythm with its purring. The effect was hypnotic, beautiful, and completely at odds with every piece of literature ever written about Venusian snapjaws. "Sweet, merciful photosynthesis," Sproutsworth whispered. "It's exhibiting contentment bioluminescence. That behavior has never been documented in laboratory settings." Maya looked up at the assembled crowd of scientists, their faces a mixture of wonder, confusion, and dawning horror at the implications of what they were witnessing. "Gee," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "I wonder why." The soft glow from the contented snapjaw cast dancing shadows across the faces of what were supposedly the galaxy's most advanced scientific minds. Maya watched them process what they'd just witnessed with the kind of intellectual whiplash usually reserved for paradigm shifts and tenure reviews. "This is catastrophic," Thornwick muttered, his forearms trembling as he stared at his life's work being systematically demolished by a human with a protein bar. 17 years of research. 17 years. "Oh, it gets worse," Maya said cheerfully, pulling out her personal tablet and scrolling through her files. "Remember the Andromedan thorn spikes that supposedly couldn't survive in artificial environments? Humans have been keeping them as houseplants for 3 years. They love classical music and grow twice as fast when you talk to them." Dr. Farnsworth made a choking sound. "That's impossible. Thorn spikes require specific atmospheric compositions and soil mineral ratios that can't be replicated outside their native environment." "Or," Maya suggested, "they require not being treated like chemistry experiments. Turns out they're actually pretty adaptable when you give them a little affection and some decent fertilizer." She swiped to another file while the Snapjaw investigated Captain Bleebus's boots with friendly curiosity. Then there's the Rigelian death moss that was supposedly impossible to contain. Humans figured out it wasn't trying to escape. It was looking for its symbiotic partner species that your researchers never bothered to identify. The death moss incident was contained, Sproutsworth said weakly. The facility only suffered minimal casualties. Because it took 3 weeks for someone to realize it was trying to reunite with its pollinator buddies, Maya replied. One human botanist spent an afternoon reading about mutualistic relationships and solved the whole thing in a day. The room was beginning to feel like the scene of an intellectual crime. Dr. Flowerbottom had gone completely pale, which for an Outer Rim dweller was quite an achievement. Are you saying that our fundamental understanding of aggressive flora is systematically flawed? I'm saying, Maya stood up, the Snapjaw immediately positioning itself at her side like a loyal guardian, that maybe when every dangerous species becomes a model citizen, the moment a human shows up, you might want to reconsider your methodology. Captain Bleebus had stopped coordinating security and was now staring at the plant that was gently nuzzling his leg. It's actually quite sweet, isn't it? They are always evil when they are not living? Dragon asked. When they're not being tortured in the name of scientific advancement. The implications were sinking in around the room like a slow-motion intellectual disaster. Maya could practically see the mental calculations happening behind their eyes. How many papers would need to be retracted? How many research grants would be questioned? How many supposedly dangerous creatures were actually just misunderstood? The Centaurian flesh finds, Flowerbottom said slowly, the ones that supposedly attack anything that moves, are probably just enthusiastic huggers, Maya finished. Humans figured that out 6 months ago. Turns out they're incredibly affectionate once you stop trying to kill them with pesticides. The plasma orchids that burn through containment units. Social flowers that literally die of loneliness when isolated. Put two together and they're happy as clams. Put them in solitary confinement and they have what humans recognize as panic attacks. Each revelation hit the assembled scientists like a physical blow. Maya was starting to feel a little bad for them. After all, they'd dedicated their entire careers to studying things they'd never bothered to actually understand. But how? Thornwick asked, his voice breaking slightly. How do humans consistently succeed where we fail? What advanced techniques do you employ? Maya looked around the room at the galaxy's supposed experts, then down at the Snapjaw, which was now completely relaxed and making soft, happy sounds as it explored its new environment with genuine curiosity, rather than desperate hunger. We pet them, she said simply. We feed them when they're hungry, give them space when they need it, and treat them like living beings instead of research projects. Revolutionary stuff, really. The Snapjaw had discovered that Captain Bleebus's boots had interesting textures and was gently investigating them with what looked like scientific curiosity of its own. The captain, meanwhile, was having what appeared to be an existential crisis. My insurance company's never going to believe this, he muttered. Look, Maya said, addressing the room. This isn't some mystical human superpower. It's basic empathy combined with paying attention to what's actually happening instead of what your textbooks say should be happening. She gestured to the Snapjaw, which had now discovered the joys of the conference hall's carpeting and was rolling around with obvious delight. This little guy wasn't trying to terrorize anyone. He was stressed, hungry, and desperately trying to communicate his needs to people who were too busy being afraid of him to listen. The behavioral literature clearly indicates, Thornwick began. The behavioral literature, Maya interrupted, was written by people who observed traumatized, isolated specimens, and somehow concluded that trauma responses were natural behaviors. It's like studying humans by watching prison riots and concluding that we're naturally violent. The comparison hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Maya could see understanding dawning on several faces, followed immediately by the kind of academic horror reserved for discovering that your entire field might be built on faulty foundations. So what do we do now? Flowerbottom asked quietly. Maya looked around the room at the dozens of supposedly dangerous specimens that were probably just lonely, scared, or misunderstood. Then she looked down at the Snapjaw, which had apparently decided her shoelaces were fascinating and was gently investigating them with its teeth. Well, she said, I guess you could start by asking them what they actually want instead of telling them what they should need. 3 hours later, Maya found herself in the unprecedented position of being the only conference attendee who wasn't having some form of existential breakdown. The Snapjaw, who she'd started calling Chompers because it seemed rude not to give him a proper name, had appointed himself her official conference companion and was currently investigating the fascinating world of shoelace physics. Dr. Rodriguez, Captain Bleebus approached with the careful steps of someone whose worldview had been recently renovated. I need to ask you a somewhat irregular question. Maya looked up from where she was documenting Chompers's behavior patterns on her tablet. The plant had discovered that different textures produced different purring frequencies, and was apparently conducting his own scientific experiments on the conference room furniture. Shoot, she said. Would you be willing to adopt that creature permanently? Bleebus's translator struggled with what sounded like desperate relief. Because frankly, I don't think my insurance company has a category for dangerous predator turns into therapy pet through the power of human common sense. Maya glanced at Chompers, who was now attempting to befriend a potted fern by gently headbutting it. The fern, being a normal plant, remained unresponsive, but Chompers seemed to interpret this as playing hard to get. I don't know, she said thoughtfully. Can I get that in writing? Because I have a feeling this little guy is going to revolutionize a few more scientific fields before we're done. Done, Bleebus said immediately. I'll have the paperwork ready within the hour. Across the room, Professor Thornwick was surrounded by the scattered remains of his research notes, looking like a man who'd just discovered that gravity worked backwards. But how? He kept muttering. How did 17 years of careful study miss something so fundamental? Easy, Maya called out. You studied the wrong thing. You studied what the plant did when it was miserable instead of what it could do when it was happy. Dr. Flowerbottom approached cautiously, her recorder held out like a peace offering. Dr. Rodriguez, would you be willing to share your techniques for the advancement of scientific knowledge, of course? Maya laughed. My techniques? I fed him, pet him, and talked to him like he mattered. If that's advanced science, then your educational systems have bigger problems than misunderstood plants. Chompers, sensing he was the center of attention, performed what could only be described as a little bow, followed by a display of bioluminescent patterns that painted the room in shifting greens and golds. The effect was stunning, beautiful, and completely at odds with every piece of literature ever written about his species. He's showing off, Maya realized. Look at him, he's actually showing off because he likes having an audience that's not trying to study him to death. The plant continued his light show, adding what sounded like a musical component to his purring. Other specimens around the room began responding, their own bioluminescent displays flickering to life in what looked like botanical communication. They're talking to each other. Sproutsworth breathed. Cross-species botanical communication. This is revolutionary. This is Tuesday, Maya corrected. For humans, anyway. We figured out that most living things like to socialize about the same time we invented agriculture. Captain Bleebus was frantically taking notes. I need to report this to the Galactic Scientific Council. The implications for xenobiology, for interspecies relations, for not being idiots, Maya suggested helpfully. Look. This isn't some mystical human superpower, it's just basic emotional intelligence. We listen, we adapt, and we don't assume that our first impression is the only possible reality. Chompers had finished his light show and was now investigating a group of Andromedan researchers who'd been observing from what they thought was a safe distance. Instead of fleeing in terror, they found themselves cautiously reaching out to touch his leaves as he purred encouragingly. Fascinating, one of them murmured. The tactile sensation is remarkably soothing. Yeah, Maya said, watching her new companion spread joy and confusion in equal measure. That's kind of the point. Professor Thornwick finally approached, his academic pride apparently losing the battle against scientific curiosity. Dr. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology, and possibly a complete reevaluation of my life's work. Don't apologize to me, Maya said, gesturing to Chompers, who was now the center of an impromptu petting circle. Apologize to him. He's the one who spent 3 days in a box being called a monster. Thornwick knelt down carefully and extended one trembling hand toward the plant. Chompers sniffed delicately, then gently bumped his head against the professor's palm. The Zentorian's expression transformed from academic devastation to something approaching wonder. He's forgiving me, Thornwick whispered. He's probably just hoping you learned something, Maya replied. Chompers here is pretty smart. Aren't you, buddy? The plant responded with a complex pattern of lights and sounds that somehow managed to convey both affection and mild reproach. The universal language of, I forgive you but don't do it again. As Maya watched the galaxy's finest minds discover that empathy worked better than theory, she couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow these researchers would go back to their labs and universities with a completely new understanding of the creatures they studied. Some would probably revolutionize entire fields. Others would have to start their careers over from scratch. But tonight, they were all just people sitting on a conference room floor, petting a plant that purred, and wondering why they'd made everything so complicated. You know what the best part is? Maya said to no one in particular, as Chompers settled down for what appeared to be a nap, his contented purring filling the room with warmth. What's that? Bleebus asked, still marveling at the fact that his insurance claims were going to be the most interesting reading his company had seen in decades. Maya scratched Chompers behind his ear one more time, earning a sleepy rumble of approval. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years. Every impossible creature, every untamable beast. We just keep proving that the universe is a lot friendlier than everyone thinks, as long as you're willing to listen. And with that, Dr. Maya Rodriguez, xenobotanist and accidental revolutionary, settled in to enjoy the sight of the galaxy's most brilliant minds, learning that sometimes the most advanced technique was just being nice.